Good morning and welcome back to Coffee Break. So, have you ever recommended a book that you loved to one of your guy friends and it was like, okay, I know this is a girl on the cover, but, or I know the main character's a girl, but, or maybe you just didn't recommend it at all to any of your guy friends because it had a girl main character?
Yeah, and why is that? Like, why, I don't know, like, because boys don't read girl books.
Right, but...
Right? Like, that's...
Like, they say if you want to have a book universally read, make it a male main character, because girls will read about boys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know why that is.
Yeah, well, and now, like, boys won't even read books about boys that were written by women. Like, that's why J.K. Rowling and S.E. Hinton used their initials so that it wasn't immediately obvious that this was written by a woman. And, like, seriously? Who pays attention to this?
Right.
I don't know. That just really irks me. Mm-hmm. That, like, boys are discouraged from reading books about girls.
Yeah, and I think it's, I don't think everyone intentionally is directing boys away from these books, but we all somehow have this internal bias.
Yeah, I think the issue is that it's a lot more culturally acceptable for girls to be masculine than for boys to be feminine. You know, and so reading is an androgynous hobby, but when you're reading a book about a female protagonist, all of a sudden it becomes feminine, and boys don't want, boys are uncomfortable with being perceived that way.
Right. Yeah, and I think just in general, this is just part of being in a patriarchal society, is that masculine is neutral. And feminine is other. It's not like we have two sides that don't really cross. There's the masculine and then feminine just doesn't belong in there.
Yeah, it's not something that we place a lot of value on.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting too because we talk about this a lot when we talk about needing diverse books, right? Is that we need to read about people different than ourselves because that fosters empathy, and that's huge for getting along in a diverse culture. But the interesting thing about girl books is that we have a lot of great books about girls. We're just not getting them into the hands of boys.
Right. Like, the campaign for We Need Diverse Books means we physically need to create more books featuring diverse characters. With girl books, we have tons of those. It's just boys aren't reading them.
Right.
And I think it's actually incredibly important for boys to read books about female protagonists. One of the biggest benefits of reading is that it increases your empathy. Like you were saying, it helps you understand other people's point of view. And for girls reading books about boys, they understand this male point of view. But if boys aren't getting that, then, it's like, oh, well, you don't need to understand girls' points of view.
Right, or it kind of keeps girls in that women are so complicated I'm never going to understand.
Yeah, it keeps them in the other category.
Right.
Yeah, when it's like, this is half of the world population, they are not in other.
Right. Do you want to understand your sister? Do you want to understand the girl you want to date?
Literally impossible to avoid interacting with them, so.
I think part of that, fostering empathy and getting to know the girl's perspective is that just like when you read any book about someone other than yourself, you start to realize that they're more similar to you than different.
Right.
And I think that's hugely important between genders. There shouldn't be this huge divide.
And there really isn't. If you take two characters, one female protagonist and one male protagonist, you can find a lot of traits that they have in common. Some differences, of course, but lots of traits that they share, and it's like, these aren't specific to men and women. These people have them together. And it highlights the ways that we're all similar.
So there are a few really good blog posts that inspired us, actually, to make this video. And they have really great suggestions for teachers and librarians and parents for encouraging boys to read girl books. And we'll link to those below. But I kind of wonder, what can we as publishers do?
Yeah, and that's something that's tricky because, of course, we're publishing books in the hopes that people buy them. And if boys aren't buying girl books, shouldn't that discourage us from publishing them?
Right, or does that mean that we should just market them only to girls because we
Right.
know that's who will typically read them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that hugely affects it, but then it's like you've got that chicken and egg thing, you know, like in order to encourage boys to read more books about girls, the publishers have to do things, you know, girl books that will
Right.
appeal to both genders and market them to both genders. But publishers aren't going to do that if they don't think the market is there. We have books that do feature female protagonists, and they have a lot more like androgynous covers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I was not in on the discussion, so this is not me clapping myself on the back. But I think these two books do a really good job of making it look like anyone would like these books, but not shying away from the fact that it's a female protagonist.
Yeah, and I think that's probably like the best way to start encouraging boys to read this, you know, like pick a nice cover and like a good description that will appeal to both girls and boys. And, you know, but be honest, you know, be honest about the fact that this has a female protagonist, and of course there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
You know, I think people kind of think that like, oh, well, I'm not directly discouraging, you know, the boys in my class or my sons from reading books about girls, so I'm not part of the problem. But if you're not introducing them to these books, then that is kind of tacitly saying that you don't think this would interest them.
Right.
And it should.
Yeah. So we would love to hear any of the suggestions that you have for what publishers can do to help this problem. And maybe you don't have any ideas, but you have other tips for teachers and parents and librarians.
Yeah, let us know in the comments or on Twitter. We would be happy to hear from you.
Our Twitter handle is @CoffeeBreakEBYR. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Well, that was a good point, but did we say that in like the most